While Iran is understandably in the global spotlight, another nation in the neighborhood may also be on the brink, Libya. Nearly 9 years since Moammar Gaddafi was overthrown, Libya is deeply divided between rival governments, one controlling the capital Tripoli and the west, the other ruling the east. Last week, Turkey announced it would send the troops to support Tripoli. 2 days later, a drone strike in Tripoli reportedly killed dozens of military cadets. On Saturday, the East voted to cut ties with Turkey, while on Monday its military announced the seizure of the strategic city of Sirte. Why is Turkey's move so sensitive in the region? Whose interests are driving what's now also a proxy war? And why does Libya's fate matter to the rest of the world today? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in our Beijing studio by Professor Zhang Yongpeng of the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, from Russia by Mark Salabada, an international affairs and security analyst from Istanbul by Serkan Oral, a Turkish political analyst and writer, and from Italy, Imeldan Badi, a policy fellow at the European University Institute. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Mr. Zhang, why do you think democracy, which took place in the aftermath of killing Moammar Gaddafi, failed to take a root in this war-torn country 8 years after the Arab Revolution?
I think the most important reason is that such kind of revolution has overthrown not only a node or previous regime, but the legal system of the governance to maintain the normal management of the social or society or economic running. And so this is the most important. And furthermore, if democracy could be practiced in such a way, it is quite far from the local or the targeted country's reality. It is not in accordance with their reality and national situation, and so. The original social organizations and systems had been completely broken. And especially for the country of Libya, they have quite a lot of the tribes, and these kind of social structures or mechanisms has been broken completely. And so when the democracy is not in accordance with the local reality, and tragedies and disasters may happen.
In other words, democracy fails to deliver good governance. Let me cross over to other guest speakers. First of all, our guest speaker in Turkey. Hello. My question is very simple. Do you believe Libya, 8 years after the Arab Revolution, is governed more by tribalism than capitalism?
It's an important question. I think, yes, there will be a peaceful solution if all the sides will leave the troops, I mean the arms, and then there will be enough time for the economical developments, because it's a huge important oil center, an energy center, even connected with Mediterranean Sea. So we should see Libya from this perspective.
You didn't answer very much my question about tribalism. Let me cross over to Italy. Hello. We are talking about the governance in Libya. Why do you think this country failed to be united, and we still see two rival governments despite the strong support of the United Nations, which is, of course, should be viewed as a mandate for the new leadership? Ironically, we have a strong man, Mr. Haftar, who controls the east. So the country has fallen apart. What would happen to the economy? And what would happen to the stakeholders there?
Well, in terms of the economy, at this stage, I think Libya is at the worst. We're doing its worst it's ever done economy-wise since its inception, particularly since a lot of debt has been incurred and a lot of funds have been diverted to fund war rather than actually have good governance, as your other guest has pointed out. The problem is, at this stage, it's very difficult to have democracy take root, particularly given the fact that a lot of foreign countries want the country to be authoritarian-led, so revert to a Gaddafi-like system. That is de facto completely overriding anything that the country wants, or a lot of the popular will within the country. And so we are now having a civil war since 2014 because of this. It's worth noting, however, that in 2012 and 2013, Libya did experience elections. Libya did experience beginning of democracy. However, it wasn't until the emergence of Khalifa Haftar on the scene in February 2014 that we began facing problems, and we began facing this dichotomy between civilian government and or authoritarianism.
Let me cross over to Moscow, where we have Mr. Mark Salvador. Your comments on the latest scenario there. The Turkish government decides to send in troops, and what would happen? What would be the consequences?
Yeah, so right now the situation is actually that General Haftar not only controls the east, but controls the vast majority of the country. The Muslim Brotherhood associated regime in Tripoli, which is pretty much backed only by Turkey and Qatar at this point, controls only Tripoli and Misrata at this point. Turkey is very afraid that the regime in Tripoli will fall very soon. Haftar is already approaching in the suburbs of Tripoli at this point in time. So he's sending really not Turkish troops there. There is some presence, but he's actually evacuating jihadists from Idlib, including the Sultan Murad Brigade of brutal Turkmen that were involved in the ethnic cleansing of Kurds from northeast Syria. This is the forces that he is sending into Libya at the moment, kind of a reverse flow from the beginning of the Syrian conflict. Meanwhile, Russia is providing security contractors and logistical support for the somewhat more secular General Haftar. But his big support actually comes from regional players: Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and in particular Saudi Arabia. Although he also has support from several Western European countries, including France.
What would happen to the oil production? Mark, Libya is one member of OPEC, and its daily production capacity is usually put at 1 million. However, this figure remains unpredictable, unstable because of the warlords, warfare, and the civil war, civil strife. In that case, a country that depends on oil for 92% of its GDP growth would plunge into a disaster. Do you think Russians would take into consideration this kind of consequences? And currently, President Putin is visiting Turkey. The two countries are at the opposite sides of the civil war. What do you think of the enormous efforts by Moscow to achieve reconciliation, very much like the case in the war-torn country of Syria between Turkey and Russia?
Yeah, of course, oil production in Libya has been completely faltering since the West-backed regime change operation there brought this grab-bab of Islamists and warlords to power in the country that have seen the decay of society, slaves being sold openly in the streets, and oil production has dropped. Now, Russia has a lot of self-interests involved here. They would like to see the restoration portion of their oil and railroad contracts that they lost when the West helped overthrow the government of Gaddafi. Right now, Haftar is in control of most of the oil production in the country, and Russia is cutting deals with him, but they're also hedging their bets and reaching across the table to strike some deals with Tripoli as well. So Russia's principally concerned about its interests in the oil there in the country and other economic interests. And a degree of inference and leverage there would increase Russia's leverage over European energy supplies, since it already provides a significant amount of oil and gas from the east of Europe through Nord Stream 1 and 2 through Ukraine, and influence in Libya as well would give Russia even more, not control, but influence and leverage over Europe via its energy supplies.
Thank you very much, Mark. Mr. Zhang, China also has a lot of oil stakes in the Middle East. 8 years ago, the rest of the world saw massive evacuation of Chinese nationals from this war-torn country. What's the current situation? Is China still able to maintain its business presence in Libya, or our presence there is zero? I've heard stories like our involvement in the construction of the local infrastructure. Is that still the case?
Yes, and so especially there are some contract projects in the eastern of Libya. There are some, but the total amount of these projects has been largely decreased compared to the previous war.
Are you suggesting quietly that China has been actively involved in the post-war reconstruction in Libya?
Yeah, I think gradually it is a process, and now Chinese companies is entering this region, in this country, but affected by this conflict, and the Chinese enterprises has to look at the crisis or the risks, and so a lot of them are just staying there. Right, and not pushing forward for more projects.
Yes, indeed. 8 years ago, China lost billions of dollars of our stakes in Libya because of the European intervention. Let me cross over to our Turkish friend. Do you believe stability remains a big issue for the business prosperity of Libya, which is ironically an oil-rich country? To what degree do you think President Erdogan sent in your troops solely to protect your business stakes in this unstable country in your neighborhood? Ironically, let me raise a follow-up question. Just shortly after President Erdogan took public office many years ago, he said Turkey should have zero problems in terms of neighboring diplomacy, or in its diplomacy with the neighboring countries. However, it seems from Syria to Libya, you've had tons of problems. It's a different story. Looking back, what can you tell us about the Turkish diplomacy with Gulf states like Libya?
Thank you. From starting your first question, yes, there will be stability, even the business issues. Look at the Qatar issue. Qatar was under blockage between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey supported Qatar, sent troops, and the blockage down. Now everything is stable in Qatar. It's same as Syria. As you know, there was a huge war going on at Idlib area, and now Turkey and Russian armed groups are working there together for the peaceful solution. Libya is an important ally for Turkey because there is a group of enemies against Turkey, especially the Greece, Israel, Egypt are going for the Mediterranean gas oil issues around Cyprus, and Turkey and Libya Tripoli government signed an agreement, and this agreement showed that Turkey will protect its security zone on the Mediterranean Sea next to the Cyprus, from Turkish coast to the Libyan coast. So all the games changed. The second thing is the Tripoli government is not only Qatar and Turkey supported by United Nations, accepted government, Tripoli government. So they demand the Turkish help, and Turkish assembly after voted, send it, the bill voted, and then the 35 Turkish soldiers with a general commander arrived to Tripoli to make the coordination. So this will be an important point for the relations between Libya, but not only that. According to the second question, this will be a domino effect, I hope, because Turkish diplomatic moves are going not only with Libya, with Algeria and also Tunis. And maybe you will see, after the Turkish troops in Libya and the stability and unity of Libya is protected, then Egypt will be at the side of Turkey, like Algeria and Tunisia. So Italy is also supporting Turkey, and it is not a big issue also between all around the world. 12 other countries Turkey sent troops. So for the stability of the Libya, Turkey sent this. But the point is that to protect the security zone on the Mediterranean Sea for the gas pipelines. And today Turkish stream is opening with Vladimir Putin in Istanbul, but Turkey has a struggle in Libya with Putin, because Erdogan asked about what is Wagner Group. Wagner Group, is it a paramilitary group taking some Sudanians or other fighters to Libya against the Tripoli government? Erdogan is asking about that. So there are conflict points with Russia. For example, in Iraq, we see the Blackwater companies, paramilitary companies, that they were not a choice to establish the peace in Iraq. And also
I'll get back to you very quickly, Mr. Aurel, on yet another issue of refugees. But first of all, let me go to Florence and to have comments from Italian guest speaker, Mr. Badi. Mr. Badi, 8 years ago, the disintegration of Libya, it's a divided country, contributed seriously to the exodus of asylum seekers that, as a major problem, divided the European Union with the Germans, calling for each member of the European Union accepting a certain quota so that it could maintain a kind of political union. Ironically, this initiative was rejected by most politicians in Central and Eastern European countries. Turkey, let me go back to Turkey. Turkey is a gateway for most of the refugees. It's a gateway to continental Europe. So today, by sending in troops, President Erdogan is likely to create more of such problems if you look at prospects of having more of such humanitarian crisis in this war-torn country of Libya. What do you think of this prospect?
Well, this process is a realistic one. However, it is important to point out that this will depend really on how and what Erdogan's military footprint will be in Libya, what his military intervention will look like. So far, it doesn't look like this intervention will lead to a lot of refugees flowing out of Libya and into Europe. Quite the contrary, actually. This is essentially Erdogan trying to save, or trying to actually cement his memorandum of understanding and make sure that the government of national accord does not fall, and therefore that Tripoli does not fall into the hands of Haftar. If Haftar switches from being fighting in Tripoli suburbs to fighting in urban areas, yes, that will lead to a lot of, first of all, internationally displaced, and second of all, also a lot of people that will probably take boats to Europe. However, that runs contrary to what Erdogan wants to do. What Erdogan wants to do is to actually freeze the fighting, it seems, and to actually stop the advances of Haftar through strategic strikes, but also the deployment of Turkish military advisors and Turkish fighters and Turkish-backed Syrian rebels as well. So I do not think, yes, it is a realistic prospect. It was a realistic prospect over the past few months. However, this is what Erdogan, to a certain extent, is trying to prevent at this stage, not trying to cause.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Mark in Moscow. Hello, Mark. We are talking about the issue of refugees.
Yes.
And also, yet another major issue is looming larger, a current race for regional leadership. Do you see an ongoing competition for regional leadership between major regional powers such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt? Why not? Egypt is one of the few countries in this region, the volatile region, that is still able to receive military assistance despite the ouster of an old friend of Washington, Mr. Mubarak, the former dictator in Cairo. So what do you think of this competition for regional leadership? And do you think President Erdogan is looming larger and fast as a strong candidate who will exercise very strong influence on the geopolitical reconfiguration in the aftermath of the Arab Spring 8 years ago?
First of all, with the potential refugee problem, if the European Union was concerned about refugees, they probably shouldn't have, conducted regime change operations to throw Gaddafi's government there. He, in fact, warned about the potential refugee problem if he was overthrown, and sure enough, that has materialized. So I think Europe kind of has to suck it up at this point. They created this mess. They broke Libya. They destroyed the country for all intents and purposes, Europe and the United States. And obviously they've never heard of the policy of you broke it, you bought it, because Europe and the United States have both basically neglected Libya, and that has led to a lot of what is happening now. And that power vacuum has led to a regional power struggle here. Turkey and Qatar are trying to exercise influence with Turkey's rather strange, slanted maritime attempt to redraw lines and grab Cyprus's energy resources in the Mediterranean. That seems to be a great deal of his motivation here. But the reality is that the Egyptian government, which has escalation superiority with its border, long border with Libya, is never going to allow a Turkish-backed Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated regime to continue in Tripoli. If Turkey escalates with military forces and moves to defeat Haftar, if they're capable of that, then Egypt will become more seriously militarily involved. And behind Egypt, of course, is Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates. And we see a bit of a regional power struggle for dominance of the Mediterranean Muslim world between Turkey and Saudi Arabia here. The problem for Turkey is that by siding with Qatar, they have alienated almost every other Gulf Arab country which adheres to Saudi Arabia, basically the rest of the entire Gulf Cooperation Council. And with the U.S. and the EU backing out, Russia is kind of stepping in to partly as a party to the conflict, at least with security contractors. But I think they're positioning themselves to be a mediator, as they have helped mediate the situation in Syria. With this meeting between Putin and Erdogan in Istanbul, there's chatter on the Russian Foreign Ministry that we may hear an announcement of something like a Astana frozen conflict agreement between Russia and Turkey for Libya. which will allow the two countries to basically play kingmakers about what happens there in the future, and a bit of give and take as they compromise to buttress each other's own national interests in the country.
Excuse me, Mark, you said earlier that the United States has backed off from the stage of Libya following the killing of their former ambassador in Benghazi. Now, one of the reasons why Iran captures headlines at this moment is, of course, Secretary Pompeo reportedly did not allow any of American diplomats in the Middle East, including in the Persian state of Iran, to be hurt by the attacks on the embassy. That reminds us, of course, of the killing, sadly, of Ambassador Steve at the height of the Arab Spring there. What do you think of the consequences of, say, the current geopolitical rivalry between Iran and the United States? Do you think another kind of proxy war is likely to take place with Iran being part of the game?
Yeah, well, Iran, of course, is not directly involved in the situation in Libya, but in the wider scope, there is an incredible geopolitical struggle now emerging across the Middle East, and it's simply not just the United States, because the U.S. has a tripod with Saudi Arabia and Israel for hegemony over the Middle East. And with this assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, along with over 40 members of the Iraqis' military forces, the Popular Mobilization Units, now officially part of the Iraqi military, answerable to the Prime Minister. This is leading to the demands for the U.S. to leave Iraq, which would necessitate the U.S. Having to pull out of Syria as well, because they wouldn't be able to maintain their logistics
Thank you very
and
much,
supplies
Mark.
there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhang. Let's look at what role China can play. Recently, Russia, Iran, and China conducted a joint maritime patrol to show their kind of solidarity, if not determination, to maintain regional stability, not very much in the Mediterranean, but in the nearby waters, Hormuz Strait, you name it. But China is one of the P5, along with Russia. We have a very special strategic partnership. What do you think of the contributions China can make in maintaining a stable region, because we have so many stakes there, as I said earlier?
Yeah. I think as one of the P5, China and Russia usually have the similar stance in the international affairs, and especially within the confine of the United Nations. And usually China, up to now, and China hold a stance that is to try to persuade the parties in conflict and sit together and talk and try to obtain and seek to reach a ceasefire agreement and such. And of course, China has a big interest in this region, in the Middle East, and strategically, this is a curved region zone, and by the strategists of the world.
Thank you very much. One of the major reasons why Chinese viewers would show great interest in the latest situation in Libya is that, in theory, democracy in the aftermath of the Arab Spring should have delivered democracy. Arab Spring should have delivered democracy. The fact is, it's not a desirable scenario, and many Chinese would have to reflect upon whether it's a wise move to transplant democracy in an underdeveloped country, despite the oil-rich effect of this member of OPEC. I will see you next time. Goodbye.